Hi, I'm Mark Aldridge, and thanks for watching my talk today. I'm really honoured to have been asked to be part of this online Agatha Christie festival. I was going to be there in person this year, taking part in a couple of events down in Torquay, and I'm really sorry that it's not happening in person, but I will be there next year, and I hope that everyone else who is going to be turning up this year will be there as well, so that I can sort of say hello to everybody and talk to you all in the flesh. Now, I was asked to put together a little talk for everyone who's watching online today. So I had a little think, and the obvious thing to talk about was Poirot, because we are now 100 years since the first publication of The Mysterious Affair at Styles, the first Poirot mystery. And I've just written a book all about Poirot to celebrate this centenary. And so what better subject for today? Now, of course, I can't talk to you about everything to do with Poirot, so I thought I'd narrow it down a little and talk today about the many faces of Hercule Poirot, really focusing on the Poirot who we've seen on film and television. But before we get into that, the face of Hercule Poirot is actually often a bone of contention, even ignoring the adaptations. Agatha Christie herself really didn't like to see Poirot depicted on covers of books, for example. She didn't mind the picture that was in the sketch, which turns up on the cover of the first edition of Poirot Investigates as well. She seemed fairly happy with that, but generally she didn't like him to appear on covers of her books. That's not to say that he didn't, especially in later paperbacks he often turns up, but in first editions he tends to be sort of hidden away, especially in later decades. And this even led to loads of debate about things like Poirot's early cases, which was published in the 1970s, and Agatha Christie was very upset about, because although it didn't show Poirot's face, the photo cover implied all sorts of things about him that she didn't like. She didn't like him having a bag. She thought that the way his legs were photographed made it look like he was taller than he should really be. So really it was in everyone's best interest to keep away from Poirot as much as possible. Agatha Christie was also asked who she would like to see play Hercule Poirot on screen or stage, and she actually said, well, I'd rather nobody did, because I'd rather he didn't appear on stage or screen at all. But we know that she seemed quite happy with Charles Laughton and Francis L. Sullivan. Interestingly, both actors who were aged up a lot for the part as well, so that didn't seem to be too much of an issue for her. And indeed, Francis L. Sullivan actually played Poirot on television once, in the very first television production of an Agatha Christie work. In 1937, the one-act Poirot play Wasp's Nest, there's also a short story of the same name, was produced for BBC television. A fantastic choice because it's got a very small cast of characters, but also a very rare appearance of Poirot on the medium. Generally, during her lifetime, Agatha Christie kept him away from TV, especially in the UK and the United States. He did pop up occasionally elsewhere, including in a West German production of Murder on the Orient Express in the 1950s. But generally, you're not going to see a lot of Poirot on TV or film during this time. He did pop up though, he wasn't completely missing from screens. So the first sort of consistent appearance of Poirot on screen was from Austin Trevor, who played him in 3 movies between 1931 and 1934. Now, the first 2 of those don't survive, unfortunately. They were productions of Alibi, which is based on Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and Black Coffee. They were both made in 1931. They don't survive, unfortunately, but reviews tell us that it was quite static, and Austin Trevor seems to have been okay. Nobody seems to have been too excited. But then we have the 1934 film of Lord Edgware Dies, which does survive and gives us a much better idea of what this version of Poirot was like. Now, the biggest shock is that not only is Poirot quite a young man at this point, but he doesn't have a moustache, which for most people would say you're not Poirot if you don't have a moustache. But this is definitely Poirot, definitely doesn't have a moustache, and perhaps even worse than that, this Poirot seems to be French, not Belgian, which is actually something that had originally popped up in the Alibi stage production as well. In both Alibi and Lord Edgware Dies, people refer to him as French and nobody corrects them. So I don't even think he's Belgian. So maybe this is another Poirot from another universe that we're seeing here. A Poirot who grew up in France, much younger than the Poirot we know.
Tell me, Hastings, is that not Brian Martin, whom we so often see in American films?
Yes, I know him slightly.
He whispers very daringly to the lady.
Yes, he's always hanging about her nowadays. She's separated from her husband, you know.
So she's married then?
Yes, she's Lady Edgware in private life.
I see.
Oh, will you pardon me for a minute, Brian? There's somebody over there I want to speak to. Hercule Poirot, I believe.
At your service, Lady Edgware.
Oh, you Frenchmen are so cute. I just love your Parisian manners.
And our English policeman, I hope.
Oh, why, yes.
My friend Captain Hastings.
How do you do?
How do you do?
Mr. Poirot, I want to consult you.
But certainly, madame. At what hour shall I call on you tomorrow?
Oh, tomorrow means nothing in my life. Only the present counts. Why not now?
By all means, if you wish. We should be quite undisturbed in there.
So Austin Trevor pops up in these three films and actually recurs in the role of Poirot quite a long time later on the radio. He does productions in the 40s and the 1950s as well in the role. So clearly he was quite well remembered by people, even if he's pretty much forgotten now, which I guess is understandable when people can't access your films very much. We don't get a lot of Poirot from that point on screen because of all sorts of negotiations and discussions. I'm not going to go into that today because we'd be here for a really, really long time. The next time that we really see him of any note is in the 1960s. There is an American pilot made of The Disappearance of Mr. Davenheim, which stars Martin Gable. That was shown but didn't seem to make much of an impact, and so a series wasn't made. And then we move on to the cinema screens. Now, Margaret Rutherford had been successful playing Miss Marple for four films for MGM during the early 1960s, and so it was Poirot's turn by 1965. The original intention was that Zero Mostel, who's probably best known for his part in The Producers, he was going to play Poirot, and he co-wrote an adaptation, very loosely an adaptation of the ABC murders. This version unfortunately upset just about everybody who read it, because in it Poirot was a womanizer, he was a victim of various pranks, there was a lot of comedy, there was a lot of sex in it. It was really a sex comedy, and eventually the deal was cancelled. So Zero Mostel was convinced, or maybe paid off, and told, no, actually, we're not going to make your version of the film. Instead, there is Tony Randall appears, and he plays Poirot in the Alphabet Murders.
MGM presents, that's me. MGM presents me as Hercule Poirot, the Belgian sleuth. Au revoir. No. Don't try to sneak up on Poirot, my friend. It could be dangerous. Oh, I know that normally, wherever Poirot goes, there is intrigue, excitement, murder. But not here, not today, not in London. No, I'm here actually simply to see my tailor. Now, if you'd been with me last week in Istanbul, well, but there we are. I'm sorry. Again, over. Please do not follow Poirot. This is London. Nothing is going to happen. Goodbye.
Now, the Alphabet Murders is still a farce. There's still a lot of comedy in it, but you can see that the scripting has changed by the time they make it. So it's not actually the same script anyway, but the principle of being a comedy is still there. And what we have actually is that Tony Randall is actually playing a fairly serious version of Poirot. Not all of the time, and he does some slightly unusual things like going bowling, which in a polo neck, which feels a little bit strange for Poirot to be doing. But nevertheless, actually, he's really not a million miles away away from the character on screen, on the page, sorry, rather than perhaps being a bit lighter than you might expect him to be, a little bit less serious. But what we've really got in the film is a lot of comedy aimed at people like Hastings. So poor old Hastings gets to be the victim of a lot of jokes, unfortunately for him. So Poirot, not a massive success. No one was very happy at this point, just getting through the film and just sort of forgetting about it as soon as possible. And it did indeed disappear for quite a long time, although it's now back on DVD and occasionally pops up on TV as well. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about too much about international adaptations, but it's worth just mentioning at this point that there were occasional Poirots elsewhere, and I think there's one really good one. In Germany in 1973, Horst Bollmann, forgive my pronunciation, he played Poirot in a television film that's a very close version of Black Coffee, the Poirot play that Agatha Christie had written in the 1920s. So actually that's a really, really nice production. He gives a serious but still sort of real version of Poirot, which is really great to see on screen after so many missteps.
Guten Abend. Guten Abend. Seine Lordschaft erwartet die Herren bereits. Würden Sie bitte ablegen?
Guten Abend.
Guten Abend, Monsieur Poirot.
Lord Emery. Nein, zu jung. Sein Sohn nehme ich an. Mein Kollege, Captain Hastings.
Hübscher Raum.
And then, of course, we have Albert Finney in Murder on the Orient Express. And this really absolutely changes the way that Agatha Christie productions are seen and elevates Poirot to even beyond the fame that he had before, because now there was a much more tangible face to put to the name. And you think about how much media is visual, it's much, much easier to say, oh yes, that's the Albert Finney character, and later Peter Ustinov character, than it is to say, oh, that's the character that I've heard on the radio or that I've read on the page. So it really helped to elevate Poirot's status. I'm not going to talk about that production too much because there's so much to say, other than to say that people were really, really happy with it. That there was a real sense that finally an Agatha Christie adaptation got it right, that it knew the best way to adapt her works. And that tended to be that you keep pretty much to what was in the original novel or story or play or whatever it is that you're adapting. That you can't just go and make loads and loads of changes and still expect it to work for people who enjoy Agatha Christie's original mysteries. Then, of course, for Death on the Nile, 1978, Peter Ustinov takes over from Albert Finney, a little bit unsure why that was. Albert Finney doesn't seem to have been particularly interested in ever doing another one, but there were certainly some discussions with him about possibly doing a second. But Peter Ustinov seems to have been a natural choice for a lot of people. A raconteur, a wit, somebody who actually had a lot of his own personality to bring to the role.
The book gives nothing at all to go on. I mean, it just says Poirot, he's a little man of comical appearance with immense black moustaches. What sort of figure do you see him as?
A rather larger man with a rather solemn black moustache, well cultivated. Well, I don't take that very seriously because I read the portion of her own autobiography now where she talks about having conceived Poirot, and it was all done by a process of elimination. She wanted to have somebody as distinctive as Sherlock Holmes, but it couldn't be a tall, thin man, so it had to be a small, more orotund character, and she thought she'd make him French in order to get right out of Sherlock Holmes's hair, but then thought that was too obvious, and so made him Belgian, which is another compromise. So as somebody who is really the result of a series of compromises, I feel quite free to make a third one, or a fourth, or a 16th, or a 29th compromise, and play it according to my own shape, without any regard for his height in the book, or his domed head, or his little grey cells.
What about his accent? Since he's Belgian, do you give us a Belgian Poirot?
No, I give you a French one, because I think most Belgians like to speak French in a very French way, but get very hurt if you think they're French. That's a complex which France produces on the Swiss as well, and on the Canadians, in fact. And I think he speaks French with the elegance which his moustache decrees.
Now, what we've got with Peter Ustinov then is a much lighter take on Poirot, somebody who perhaps is a little bit less like the Poirot of the printed page, but probably someone who is a bit more fun to spend time with, either in reality or on screen for a couple of hours if you're sat down watching one of the film adaptations. Now, one appearance of Poirot that a lot of people are likely not to have seen or to have forgotten and seen decades ago, perhaps only once, is something called Murder by the Book, which starred Dame Peggy Ashcroft as Agatha Christie alongside Sir Ian Holm as Poirot. And this was an original drama which was based on the idea of what would have happened if just before Curtain was published in the 1970s, Poirot turns up at the doorstep of Agatha Christie and said, "What do you think you're doing seeing the end of Poirot? Why are you going to publish the end of Poirot? Why are you even thinking about possibly killing me off?" So the whole drama is a discussion between the two of them, and it's absolute delight. It's really well researched. It's got a fantastic depiction of Poirot, who's very close to that version that we know Agatha Christie had really liked, that we saw on the first edition of Poirot Investigates and had originally been seen in the sketch. And what we have is a really fascinating discussion that looks at the links between the creator, the author, and the fictional character, perhaps the wranglings, internal wranglings that might have come out of that. But most of all, it's really entertaining. It's a very interesting idea, and Holm gives a fantastic performance as a very fussy, very difficult Poirot, who nevertheless is very amusing at the same time.
You've read it?
As much as I need.
You know, Monsieur Poirot, I think it's time for the confession. Where to begin? It's quite true that when I wrote Curtain, I fully intended it for immediate publication. Apart from everything else, you were simply getting too old. You see, I made a dreadful mistake. I made you too old right at the beginning at Styles. That was, let me see, 1920. And after that, I had to make you a bit older with each book. You know, readers spot these things. Anyway, by 1940, you'd had a good run for your money. You were pushing 80. That's too old, isn't it? For a detective to be effective.
Please proceed.
Well, that's it, really.
At the beginning, you said apart from everything else, I was too old. I should like to know what you meant by everything else.
So when we get to 1989, we're going to get to the Poirot who's probably most famous, the depiction of Poirot that's probably most well known, and that is David Suchet, who for many people would end up being the definitive portrayal of the character. Now, David Suchet had actually been in frame for the part for quite a long time. It's often said that Rosalind Hicks, Agatha Christie's daughter, saw him in Blot on the Landscape, a TV drama, and said, "Yes, that's our Poirot," and that may well be true, but what's also true is that in 1984 he had actually been one of the suggested names for what became Murder by the Book. So he'd been in the sort of pool of possible Poirots for quite a long time. Now, I don't think anybody expected that he was ever going to film all of the Poirot productions, all of the Poirot stories, but nevertheless he pretty much did, went all the way up to Curtain nearly 25 years after he had filmed the first Poirot story for the screen. And of course, this meant that there were an awful lot of stories to get through, and a lot of them needed a bit of embellishing. They needed to add some more to make it for a full hour of TV. So, for example, the Case of the Missing Will, which is, you know, very few pages in a short story collection, ends up having to be expanded to an hour of TV by a lot of extra plotting being added. But also there are things like The Big Four, which is sort of a novel, but actually really is a collection of short stories, and yet somehow has to work for 2 hours on TV, just like The Labours of Hercules has to do. So there's a bit of crowbarring in there, but clearly a real intention to tick off as many from the list as possible. A couple didn't make it to screen. Black Coffee, the play, which I don't think most people thought was going to be part of the TV series anyway, but it was actually on the long list of possible adaptations for a little while in the early 90s, but eventually didn't make it. But there's also the Le Mesurier Inheritance, which is a short story that didn't make it to screen. That's quite a long story, and I'm tempted to say buy my book to find out more, but the very short version of it is that it basically lost out to Yellow Iris, which is another Poirot short story that had popped up in the Problem at Pollenza Bay short story collection of the early 90s, and suddenly it was felt, well, maybe it would be quite a good idea to film that one. So that was added to the list, and unfortunately the Le Mesurier Inheritance lost out to that. So David Suchet playing Poirot for all of that time. He's not the only person to be Poirot during this period, though. There are occasional appearances, usually international, but one in an English language production of Murder on the Orient Express in 2001. And in this adaptation, Poirot is in the modern day, or at least a version of it, as seen in this film.
I thought you despised computers.
I do. They are a poor substitute for the little grey cells, but sometimes they are surprisingly useful. Of course. How could I have forgotten?
Welcome.
Steve Armstrong and Arbuthnot were roommates in college together, where they created Cheetah, the famous operating system. They remained friends after that, even when their careers diverged. Arbuthnot founded Digisaurus, and Steve Armstrong created Whizbang. A very well-known man. Steve Armstrong was a genius at designing and marketing software. At one time, Whizbang was so powerful it was considered a threat to Microsoft.
Even in 2001, it seemed to have a very unsophisticated idea of what modern day actually meant. And I think this is a real shame, because actually I think the idea of Poirot solving crimes in the present day is a really interesting one. It might be that for a lot of you that's a terrible idea, but I think that actually we've got these great prestige productions that Suchet has done. So why not try something else? Why not sort of do a Sherlock with Poirot and see what happens? Unfortunately, this production of Murder on the Orient Express is certainly not that. Very unsophisticated. It's got very heavy-handed use of technology, which is entirely unconvincing. But it was an attempt to do something new, and I think that everybody involved felt that it was a worthwhile but failed experiment by the time that it went out, and it sort of disappeared from the radar quite comprehensively in the last couple of decades. Now, I do want to give a shout out to some of the international versions of Poirot. I particularly want to pay attention to Japan, because in Japan they've been very loyal to the character, and there have been lots of depictions of him on screen. One of my favourite series of adaptations is actually a Japanese anime series which adapts various Poirot and Miss Marple stories, both novels and short stories, and is very, very faithful to them, despite the fact that they also feature a duck. So you have to sort of live with the fact that Miss Marple's niece, who's sort of our narrator, she does have a duck, and they do go around sort of telling everybody what's going on. So if you can sort of live with that, then actually the rest of it is really very faithful and very close to what the stories were originally trying to do. And they're great fun, and they look good, and they're really, really sweet. So I would really encourage people to go and search them out if you've never seen them before. But there is also live action Poirot in Japan. There are a couple of adaptations in sort of 2005-ish, including of the ABC murders and of Murder on the Links. And then more recently, we've seen a version of Poirot appearing in really quite lavish and prestigious Japanese productions of Murder on the Orient Express, followed by the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, both of which tell a story in their own way. Murder on the Orient Express is really interesting because it's actually in two parts. The first part is pretty much the mystery as we know it, and then the second part actually is a flashback. It's an entire sort of film that shows us what happened in the Armstrong house as we know it years previously that led to the events in Murder on the Orient Express. It's a really fascinating way to do it. So this version of Poirot is a bit of a comedy character. He's much younger than the Poirot of the page, but he's still got this fantastic moustache. He's also actually not called Poirot, but I think that we can assume that that's who he's probably supposed to be.
姉さん姉さんイエーイおおなんだ失礼しました先生杉野さん驚かさないでくださいよ勝呂です勝呂さん散々苦労した末にまさかこんないびつなものができてしまうとはそれで腹いせにいや狙ったわけではありません手が滑ったのですしかし多少いびつな方が味が濃くて美味しいと聞きますよ味は関係ないのです私は火の打ちどころのない美しいかぼちゃが作りたかったのですもうやめてくださいモグロさんちょっと何やってんだあんたすぐのです
But he's having a lot of fun and is actually a really good sort of lightening of the mood and yet really taking the cases seriously as well. So it's great to see Poirot really being approached differently in lots of different countries. And of course, we see our own versions of that in the UK. We see that in the ABC Murders, of course, starring John Malkovich, what we've got there is a different Poirot. It's definitely not the Poirot that Agatha Christie wrote in all of those novels. What it is an extrapolation of what Sarah Phelps sees, the screenwriter saw as Poirot from having read the ABC Murders, with an entirely new backstory. So this is a parallel universe version of Poirot, and I don't think anyone's expecting there to be more sort of mysteries starring this particular version of the character. But certainly it's interesting to see a new take on it. And then we get Murder on the Orient Express and The Forthcoming Death on the Nile with Kenneth Branagh starring as Poirot. And this is a Poirot who's very, very meticulous, just like he is on the page. He's a little bit younger than the Poirot you might see on page. He's also, I would say, a bit more amiable, a little bit in the sort of Ustinov mould of saying, well, actually, is this necessarily somebody you want to spend 2 hours of time with? And I think that Kenneth Branagh's version is much more personable. It's much more likely to make friends with people than be the sort of observer fixated on the case that we might see in a lot of Agatha Christie's original stories. And that makes sense for a big budget mainstream movie. Now, of course, we don't know what the future holds for Poirot. We might see all sorts of new reinventions, and certainly now that we've got the almost full run of Poirot stories as starring David Suchet in that series, which is very widely seen even now, it might be the chance for people to take Poirot in an entirely new direction, perhaps in a sort of Sherlock-style reinvention, or maybe even something crazier. Maybe we will see Poirot solving mysteries in space or in the far future, or whatever it is that you can think of. There's no reason why Poirot, who's always a little bit out of his time anyway, it'd be interesting to see him in some new scenarios perhaps. But I think that whatever happens, Poirot's not going to go anywhere for a very long time. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that you found some of that interesting. There's so much that I could have spoken about, and there's loads that I could have gone into more detail about. But there's only so long that your attention will last and that I can speak to you for. If you do want to find out more, I do have, as I say, a book coming out all about 100 years of Poirot, which you might well enjoy. So forgive the plug, but hopefully some of you will find that brand new information in it really, really interesting. I am sorry again that the festival didn't happen this year in person, and I'm thrilled that we're able to do something online, and that so at least we can have some connection. But I will be there next year, and I really hope that I can see you all there as well. Thank you very much.